The room went silent so fast you could hear silverware touch porcelain. My ex-husband was standing beside his new wife with one hand wrapped around a champagne glass, smiling for photographs beneath a ceiling covered in white roses and crystal lights. 3 months earlier, we had finalized our divorce after 26 years of marriage. 3 months after that, he was already marrying the woman he swore was just a colleague. Then his mother stood up. Not dramatically, not angrily. She simply placed her napkin beside her plate and looked directly at her son. "A loyal woman can carry a marriage for years," she said calmly, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "But eventually she gets tired of carrying it alone. People stopped chewing, stopped whispering, stopped moving altogether." And then she said the sentence that shattered the entire evening. Daniel didn't lose his marriage because someone younger came along. He lost it because he stopped valuing the woman who stood beside him for 26 years. By the next morning, half the guests were talking about the speech. But I wasn't there to hear it. I was 300 miles away, standing barefoot in my kitchen, watering herbs, beside an open window overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. The strange thing about the end of my marriage was that it never truly felt explosive. People expect divorces to arrive with screaming matches, broken dishes, dramatic betrayals discovered at midnight. Mine ended quietly, the same way it had slowly been dying for years. I remember sitting in the parking lot outside my attorney's office the afternoon I signed the final papers. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, while other people hurried through downtown Portland with umbrellas tilted against the wind. My hands rested loosely in my lap and I waited for grief to arrive. It never did. What I felt instead was exhaustion leaving my body. My name is Claire Mercer. I was 52 years old when my marriage officially ended, though emotionally it had probably ended long before either of us admitted it. Daniel Mercer had once been charming in the effortless way confident men often are. He knew how to fill a room with conversation, how to make strangers laugh within minutes, how to turn ambition into something attractive instead of intimidating. When we met in our 20s, I admired the way he seemed so certain about life. Back then, certainty felt safe. For a while, we really were happy. Or maybe we were simply young enough to mistake momentum for happiness. As Daniel's career in financial consulting grew, our lives became polished from the outside. Bigger house, country club dinners, expensive vacations carefully photographed and posted online. People constantly described us as successful. But success can hide 1,000 quiet lonelinesses. At some point, our conversations stopped sounding like conversations. They became updates, schedules, logistics. He stopped asking questions whose answers actually mattered. If I spoke about my work, he nodded while checking emails. If I talked about feeling tired, he reminded me how stressful his clients were. The loneliness arrived in pieces so small I barely noticed them at first. Daniel no longer looked at me when I entered a room. He answered half my sentences with distracted hums. He started eating dinner with his phone beside his plate, smiling at messages that clearly mattered more than anything I was saying. He didn't leave me all at once. He disappeared in small ways. By the time Vanessa entered the picture, our marriage already felt hollow enough to echo. Vanessa Cole worked at Daniel's firm. 32, sharp suits, impossibly polished hair, the kind of woman who made effort look effortless. I met her once at a company holiday party. She shook my hand warmly and complimented my earrings, while Daniel watched her with a brightness in his eyes I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Women know. Not always immediately, not always completely, but we know when another woman has entered the emotional space that used to belong to us. At first I told myself I was imagining things. Daniel worked later, took more business trips, started protecting his phone like it contained state secrets. But the real betrayal wasn't physical, it was emotional. He laughed more texting her than he ever did sitting across from me. The actual discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had been folding laundry in the living room when his iPad lit up on the coffee table beside me. Daniel had forgotten it at home. A message appeared across the screen. "Can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore." My chest tightened before I even opened it. There were months of messages, jokes, hotel reservations, complaints about me disguised as humor, conversations about future vacations they planned to take together. The worst part wasn't the affair itself. It was how naturally they discussed a future where I no longer existed. I remember sitting there in complete silence while late afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the hardwood floor. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower hummed in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Meanwhile, my marriage quietly collapsed inside my hands. That night, Daniel came home smelling faintly of expensive cologne and winter air. He loosened his tie while talking about traffic and client meetings. I watched him from across the kitchen island and realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry. I was finished. If I screamed, he would deny it. If I cried, he would minimize it. If I begged, he would resent me for making him uncomfortable. So I did none of those things. The next morning, I called an attorney. Daniel seemed almost confused by my calmness when I finally told him I wanted a divorce. He stared at me across the dining room table as though I were overreacting to something temporary. "Claire," he said carefully, "you're being emotional." I almost laughed at that. After 26 years of shrinking my feelings into manageable sizes for his convenience, the one thing I no longer felt was emotional. The divorce process itself moved surprisingly fast. No children left at home to complicate things. No dramatic courtroom battles. Just paperwork signatures, negotiations spoken in controlled voices across polished conference tables. Daniel acted irritated more than devastated, as though the divorce was an inconvenience interrupting his real life. And maybe it was. 3 months after the papers were finalized, he announced his engagement to Vanessa. People expected me to fall apart when they heard the news. Instead, I planted rosemary in the garden behind my grandmother's cottage overlooking the water in Bar Harbor, Maine. The soil smelled rich and damp beneath my fingertips. Cold wind drifted in from the ocean while gulls circled somewhere overhead. My phone buzzed with another message from an old friend asking if I was okay. I looked out toward the gray Atlantic stretching endlessly beyond the cliffs and realized something quietly astonishing. I was. When I first arrived in Bar Harbor, the house smelled like cedar salt air and old books. My grandmother's cottage sat at the end of a narrow coastal road lined with pine trees bent sideways by decades of Atlantic wind. The paint on the porch railing had faded years ago, and one shutter hung slightly crooked beside the upstairs bedroom window. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't luxurious. But the moment I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, my shoulders loosened in a way they hadn't in years. The silence there felt different. Not empty. Gentle. For nearly 3 decades, I had lived inside noise disguised as success. Phones buzzing during dinner, television murmuring in the background while Daniel answered emails. Conversations interrupted halfway through because something more important always demanded his attention. In Maine, mornings arrived quietly. I could hear gulls outside before sunrise, and the soft ticking of the old kitchen clock my grandmother had kept above the stove since the 70s. At night, wind moved through the pine trees like distant ocean waves. Nobody demanded anything from me there. And for the first time in years, I realized how tired I had been. The first few weeks felt strangely unreal. I unpacked slowly, room by room, as though I were learning how to inhabit my own life again. I stacked books on shelves, folded sweaters into drawers, hung framed photographs I had almost forgotten I owned because Daniel never liked too many personal things cluttering the walls. The house itself seemed to breathe with me. There was a small garden behind the cottage where my grandmother used to grow herbs and climbing roses. Most of it had become overgrown after her death, but I spent hours outside clearing weeds and turning soil with a pair of old gardening gloves I found beneath the kitchen sink. Something about working with my hands calmed me. The physical simplicity of it. Dirt beneath my nails, wind against my face, the visible proof that neglected things could still come back to life with enough care. My mornings developed a rhythm. Coffee on the porch wrapped in a sweater while fog rolled across the coastline. Long walks near the harbor before tourists crowded the streets. Grocery shopping at the tiny local market where cashiers actually looked people in the eye when they spoke. Back in Connecticut, people constantly performed importance for one another. Here, nobody cared who your husband had been or what neighborhood you used to live in. Here I was simply Claire. About a month after moving, I found part-time work at a small independent bookstore near downtown. The owner, Margaret, was a silver-haired woman in her 60s who wore oversized glasses on beaded chains and smelled faintly of lavender lotion. During my interview, she asked me what kinds of books I loved and whether I preferred early mornings or afternoons. That was it. No carefully polished resume discussion, no judgment hidden behind polite smiles, no subtle measuring of social status. At one point, she glanced toward the reading glasses hanging from my sweater collar and laughed softly. "You look like someone who still enjoys hardcover books," she said. "I do." "Good," she replied. "People who love hardcover books tend to stay a while." I started the following Monday. The bookstore became my anchor faster than I expected. I shelved novels, organized displays, recommended mysteries to retired tourists escaping Boston winters. Some afternoons I worked quietly behind the register while rain streaked across the front windows and jazz played softly through the speakers overhead. Nobody interrupted me when I spoke there. That detail sounds small until you've spent years being talked over by someone who supposedly loved you. Margaret listened carefully whenever I offered ideas about displays or events. Customers thanked me for recommendations. Local regulars remembered my name. It felt strange at first, being treated like my presence carried value. One afternoon after closing, Margaret handed me a mug of tea while we sorted newly arrived shipments in the back room. "You seem calmer lately," she said casually. I smiled faintly. "Lately. When you first arrived here, you moved like someone waiting for bad news." The comment startled me because it was true. For years, my nervous system had adapted itself around Daniel's moods, around anticipating disappointment before it arrived, around monitoring the emotional temperature of every room without realizing I was doing it. I used to believe that was love. Now I understood it was survival. Healing didn't happen dramatically. There were no cinematic breakthroughs or tearful revelations beside crashing waves. Most days it arrived quietly through routine, through ordinary moments stacking themselves together until life no longer felt heavy. I slept through the night again. I cooked meals because I enjoyed them, not because someone expected dinner waiting on the table by 6:30. I read novels in bed with windows cracked open to the ocean air. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes. The silence no longer sounded lonely. It sounded peaceful. Occasionally, people from my old life still reached out. Former neighbors, mutual friends, women who pretended concern while secretly gathering information. Most conversations eventually drifted toward Daniel. Apparently, his engagement to Vanessa had become something of a spectacle back home. Lavish venue, designer invitations, expensive floral arrangements flown in from New York, social media posts carefully curated to look effortless. One evening, my longtime friend Linda called while I was trimming basil in the kitchen. So she said carefully, "The wedding's next Saturday." I kept clipping stems into a ceramic bowl. I figured it was soon. "She's wearing custom Vera Wang." I laughed softly under my breath. Well, thank God, I was worried. Linda paused, probably surprised by the humor in my voice. "You really okay?" Outside the kitchen window, the sky had turned pale gold over the water. Somewhere nearby, a buoy bell echoed faintly across the harbor. And unexpectedly, I realized I meant it when I answered. "Yes," I said quietly, "I really am." The morning of Daniel's wedding, I woke before sunrise and drove north along the coastline, with coffee balanced in the cup holder beside me. The roads were nearly empty except for fishermen heading toward the docks in heavy jackets. I spent the morning wandering through a local farmer's market near Ellsworth. Fresh blueberries, handmade soap, wildflower bouquets tied with twine, ordinary little things. Around noon, I stopped at a tiny waterfront cafe where the waitress already knew my order. "Blueberry scone today?" she asked. "Always." Meanwhile, somewhere several states away, Daniel and Vanessa were likely posing beneath crystal chandeliers, surrounded by people dressed in formal wear. And strangely enough, the farther my old life drifted into the distance, the smaller it began to feel. That afternoon, I worked in the garden until sunset stained the horizon pink and gold. Dirt covered my jeans. Wind tangled my hair. My phone stayed forgotten inside the house for hours. For the first time in decades, I understood something clearly. Their celebration no longer had anything to do with my life. The call came the morning after the wedding. I was standing barefoot in my kitchen slicing peaches for breakfast when my phone buzzed against the counter. Outside the open window, rain drifted softly across the harbor, turning the water silver beneath the cloudy sky. Linda's name flashed across the screen. The second I answered, I could hear the disbelief in her breathing. "Claire," she said, "you are not going to believe what happened last night." I leaned against the counter quietly. "That bad?" There was a pause. Daniel's mother stood up during the reception toast and practically destroyed the entire room. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood her. Eleanor Mercer was not dramatic. In 26 years I had never once seen that woman raise her voice in public. She belonged to a generation that handled disappointment with tightened smiles and carefully folded napkins. Even when she disapproved of something, she usually communicated it through silence, especially with Daniel. "Start from the beginning," I said softly. Linda exhaled hard, already eager to relive the scene. According to her, the wedding itself looked exactly the way everyone expected. Excessive in the polished, expensive way people confuse with elegance. The ceremony took place at a private country club outside Greenwich. White orchids everywhere, string quartet during cocktails, champagne towers balanced beneath golden chandeliers. "It looked like a luxury hotel advertisement," Linda muttered. That sounded like Daniel. For years, appearances had mattered to him more than comfort, honesty, or peace. He liked things that impressed people, expensive watches, exclusive memberships, conversations loud enough for nearby tables to overhear. Linda told me Vanessa spent most of the evening posing for photographs while guests floated between the ballroom and terrace carrying cocktails worth more than my grocery bill for the week. "And Daniel?" I asked. He looked thrilled with himself. That part didn't surprise me either. Daniel always loved admiration, not attention exactly. Admiration, there's a difference. Attention can be negative. Admiration feeds something deeper in people like him. The reception had apparently gone smoothly at first. Dinner served on time, speeches from friends and co-workers, toasts about new beginnings and second chances, Vanessa crying carefully enough not to ruin her makeup. Then Eleanor stood. Linda said the room immediately quieted because people respected her. Eleanor carried herself with the kind of old-money composure that made others instinctively listen when she spoke. She wore a navy satin gown and pearl earrings she'd owned for decades. Nothing flashy, nothing desperate, just dignified. She looked calm, Linda said. That's what made it so uncomfortable. I could picture it perfectly. Eleanor lifting her wine glass slowly while Daniel smiled beside Vanessa, assuming his mother was about to give some warm, sentimental speech about happiness and family. Instead, she looked directly at him. Then she said very clearly, "A loyal woman can carry a marriage for years. But eventually she grows tired of carrying it alone." Linda stopped talking for a second, almost recreating the silence that followed. I stood motionless in my kitchen. Rain tapped softly against the windows. "What did Daniel do?" I asked quietly. At first, nothing. He just froze. Of course he did. Because humiliation lands differently when it comes from someone whose approval you've spent your whole life needing. According to Linda, several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances immediately. People knew about Vanessa, obviously. The timeline alone guaranteed gossip. But wealthy social circles survive on politeness. Most people would never openly acknowledge what everyone already understood. Eleanor had. And then she kept going. She said, Linda hesitated slightly before continuing. Daniel didn't lose his marriage because someone younger came along. He lost it because he stopped valuing the woman who stood beside him for 26 years. I closed my eyes. Not because it felt satisfying, because hearing the truth spoken aloud after years of silence felt strangely painful. Linda lowered her voice. Claire, the entire room went dead quiet. I imagined Vanessa standing there in her expensive white gown with a smile slowly hardening around the edges. I imagined Daniel gripping his champagne glass too tightly, while guests suddenly found the centerpieces fascinating. But Eleanor still wasn't finished. She looked right at Vanessa. Linda continued carefully and said, "Some women enter a relationship believing they won something. But if a man is willing to betray loyalty once eventually, he'll betray comfort too." "Oh my God," I whispered. "I know." There was no yelling, No dramatic accusations. That was the devastating part. Eleanor spoke with complete composure as though she were discussing the weather over afternoon tea, which somehow made every word cut deeper. Linda told me nobody knew how to react afterward. Some guests stared into their wine glasses. Others glanced toward Daniel, waiting for him to laugh it off somehow. Vanessa apparently tried smiling through the tension, but the room had already shifted. The illusion cracked. And once people start noticing cracks, they notice everything. Someone whispered about how quickly the engagement happened after the divorce. Another person mentioned rumors that Daniel had been involved with Vanessa long before I ever moved out. A few guests quietly remembered dinners where Daniel spent more time texting than speaking to his wife. Truth spreads fast once someone gives people permission to acknowledge it. How did Daniel handle it? I asked. Linda let out a humorless laugh. Not well. Apparently he pulled Eleanor aside near the dance floor afterward. Voices stayed low at first, but guests could still see the anger in his face. Vanessa disappeared into the restroom for nearly 20 minutes, while the band awkwardly continued playing jazz standards to a room full of people pretending not to gossip. And Eleanor. She never raised her voice, Linda said. She just looked disappointed. That word settled heavily inside me. Disappointed, not furious, not emotional, simply disappointed in the man her son had become. I moved toward the kitchen window while Linda continued describing the aftermath. Outside fog drifted low across the harbor while fishing boats rocked gently against the docks. A strange ache pressed against my chest then. Not longing, not regret. Grief, maybe. Not for the marriage itself. For the years I spent trying to earn tenderness from someone who only valued me once other people pointed out my absence. You know what the strangest part was? Linda said finally. What I don't think Eleanor was trying to humiliate him. I stared out toward the gray Atlantic quietly. No, I said after a moment. She was trying to tell the truth. That afternoon after we hung up, I walked down toward the shoreline alone. Cold wind swept across the rocks while waves crashed below the cliffs in steady rhythm. I pulled my sweater tighter around myself and watched gulls circle overhead against the cloudy sky. Somewhere far away, Daniel was probably still furious. But for the first time in years, his emotions no longer belonged to me. By Monday morning, people were already talking. Not publicly, at least not at first. People in Daniel's social circle preferred subtlety. They disguised gossip as concern and humiliation as sympathy. But according to Linda, the wedding speech had spread through Connecticut faster than a winter flu. Someone recorded part of Eleanor's toast on their phone. Not the entire thing, just enough. Enough to capture the silence in the ballroom after her words landed. Enough to show Daniel standing rigid beside Vanessa, while guests stared into their champagne glasses, pretending not to witness the collapse happening directly in front of them. By Tuesday, clips were circulating privately between group chats and country club circles. By Wednesday, people Daniel worked with had seen them too. That was the thing about carefully constructed images. They looked solid until one honest moment exposed how fragile they really were. Daniel had spent years building a reputation around control, calm, precision, reliability. Clients trusted him because he appeared composed no matter what happened. Then suddenly there was video footage of his own mother publicly questioning his character during his wedding reception. People notice things like that, especially in finance. A week later, Linda called again while I was reorganizing shelves at the bookstore. Rain hammered softly against the front windows, while Margaret worked quietly nearby sorting invoices. Apparently one of Daniel's biggest clients postponed a meeting, Linda whispered dramatically. I slid a stack of novels into place. Linda. What? I'm just telling you what I heard. I sighed softly, though, not because I was annoyed with her. Linda processed emotions through information. Gossip to her was less about cruelty and more about trying to understand how people unraveled. Still hearing updates about Daniel's life no longer created satisfaction inside me. Mostly it created distance. According to Linda, several things had started shifting at once. One senior partner at Daniel's firm quietly transferred a major account elsewhere. A longtime client suddenly stopped returning calls. Another requested meetings with someone more stable. Not because Daniel cheated. Affairs alone rarely destroy powerful men socially, but public instability does. The footage from the wedding made him look impulsive, arrogant, emotionally careless. And in professions built on trust, perception matters almost as much as competence. People are whispering that he's distracted, Linda continued. Apparently he snapped at someone during a meeting. I looked toward the front of the store where an older couple stood browsing travel books together. The husband pointed excitedly toward a guidebook about Nova Scotia, while his wife laughed softly beside him. Simple warmth. For years I convinced myself marriage required emotional starvation to survive. Watching ordinary tenderness now sometimes felt more shocking than betrayal. "How's Vanessa handling all this?" I asked. Linda hesitated. Not great. Apparently, the glamorous newlywed image had faded almost immediately after the reception disaster. Vanessa had expected admiration, envy, validation. Instead, she walked into weeks of quiet judgment and whispered speculation. People who once praised her beauty now looked at her differently. Not openly cruel, just cautious, curious, like someone observing damage from a safe distance. And Daniel, according to nearly everyone, had become impossible to live with. The anger embarrassed him most. That was the irony, not the affair itself, not the divorce, the humiliation. Daniel could survive guilt far easier than he could survive public embarrassment. Linda told me he started drinking more heavily at social events, talking too loudly, over-explaining things nobody asked about, correcting people aggressively during conversations. "He sounds exhausted," she admitted finally. I said nothing. Because somewhere beneath the disappointment and resentment, I still knew Daniel well enough to understand what was happening to him. For years he built his identity around external admiration. Success, appearance, control. But admiration is fragile when it depends entirely on performance. And once people begin questioning the performance, everything underneath starts trembling too. A few nights later, my phone rang close to midnight. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. I stared at it while the sound echoed softly through my dark bedroom. Outside, rain moved against the windows in slow, steady waves. For a second, muscle memory almost made me answer immediately. 26 years teaches your body certain reflexes, late-night calls, managing tension, anticipating moods before words even arrive. But I didn't answer. The ringing stopped, then started again. I let it go to voicemail. His message lasted less than 30 seconds. "Claire," he said, voice rougher than I remembered. I need to talk to you. Call me back. No apology, no explanation. Just loneliness finally discovering itself." I deleted the voicemail the next morning while drinking coffee on the porch. Not out of cruelty, out of understanding. There was nothing left to discuss. A few days later, I received an unexpected call from Eleanor. We had spoken only briefly since the divorce. Birthday cards, holiday texts, quiet, careful communication balanced delicately between affection and guilt. Her voice sounded tired when I answered. "I hope I didn't make things harder for you," she said softly. I leaned back in my porch chair, watching fog drift over the coastline. "You didn't." A long silence passed between us. Finally, she sighed. I should have said something years ago. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. Eleanor had spent most of her life protecting peace through silence. Like many women from her generation, she believed endurance itself was virtue. Keep the family together. Avoid public discomfort. Preserve appearances. But appearances eventually become prisons. "You loved him," she said quietly. "You stood by him through everything. And somewhere along the way he started treating that loyalty like entitlement." My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not because I needed validation anymore, but because being seen clearly after years of invisibility still felt emotional. "I'm not angry anymore," I admitted softly. "I know. And honestly, I don't think you were trying to hurt him." "No," Eleanor said after a pause. "I think I was trying to stop lying to myself." After we hung up, I sat outside for a long time listening to waves crash against the cliffs below. The strange thing about healing is that eventually revenge stops feeling satisfying in theory. Peace becomes more appealing than punishment. Daniel's life was unraveling because truth finally entered rooms where performance used to live. And none of it required my participation. That realization felt lighter than anger ever could. Autumn arrived quietly along the Maine coast. The tourist crowds disappeared first. Then the harbor grew calmer, slower, softer around the edges. Pine trees darkened against pale gray skies while cold wind carried the sharp scent of salt water through town. By October, my life no longer felt temporary. The bookstore had become part of my routine in the same natural way morning coffee or ocean air had. Margaret trusted me enough to manage inventory orders on my own, and local customers now greeted me by name when they walked through the front door. Some evenings after closing, I stayed late rearranging displays while jazz drifted softly through the empty store. I liked those quiet hours most. The soft creak of wooden floors beneath my feet. The warm glow of reading lamps against shelves lined with stories about people surviving impossible things. There was comfort in that. Outside of work, my world kept expanding in small, meaningful ways. I joined a community gardening group that met every Saturday morning near the marina. I started taking watercolor classes at a tiny art studio above a bakery downtown, mostly because I wanted to try something new without worrying whether I'd be good at it. That freedom still felt unfamiliar sometimes. For years, every choice I made unconsciously revolved around another person's preferences, moods, or schedule. Even simple decisions carried invisible calculations attached to them. Now my life belonged entirely to me. And surprisingly, it was enough. One cold evening in late October, I came home to find orange leaves scattered across the porch steps and a voicemail waiting on my phone. Daniel again. I almost deleted it immediately. Instead, after standing in the kitchen for several minutes listening to the kettle heat on the stove, I pressed play. His voice sounded older somehow. Not physically older, emotionally worn down. "Claire," he said slowly, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I just wanted to say I've been thinking about things lately." A pause. "I didn't realize how much you held together." I closed my eyes briefly. Not because the words moved me, because they arrived years too late. The message continued. "The house feels different now, empty." Another silence. "I guess I just never understood what you actually meant to my life." The kettle began whistling softly behind me. I turned off the stove while his voice continued speaking quietly through the phone. And suddenly I realized something that surprised me. I no longer needed him to understand. For years I believed closure depended on acknowledgement, on being fully seen by the person who hurt you, but healing had slowly taught me otherwise. Some truths arrive too late to rebuild anything. When the voicemail ended, I deleted it gently and poured tea into my favorite blue ceramic mug. Outside, rain moved steadily across the dark coastline. Inside, my home felt warm, peaceful, mine. A week later, Eleanor visited Maine unexpectedly. She called ahead that morning, sounding almost shy. "I was driving north to visit an old friend in Camden," she explained carefully. "I wondered if I could stop by for coffee." When she arrived that afternoon, she stood on the porch wearing a long camel-colored coat with fallen leaves caught near the hem. She looked smaller somehow than I remembered, not weaker, just tired in the quiet way aging sometimes reveals itself all at once. I welcomed her inside. For a while, we simply sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while rain tapped softly against the windows. The house smelled like cinnamon from the muffins I'd baked earlier that morning. Finally, Eleanor looked around the kitchen slowly. "You seem happy here," she said. The comment settled softly between us. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just true. "I think I am," I admitted. She nodded as though confirming something to herself. Then, after a long silence, she sighed quietly and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Daniel blames me for everything now." I looked down at the steam rising from my mug. "That must be hard." "It is." She gave a sad little smile, but not as hard as watching him become someone I barely recognize. Outside, wind rattled branches gently against the side of the house. Eleanor stared toward the window for a moment before speaking again. "You know," she said softly, "when you first married him, I thought you balanced him." I smiled faintly. That sounds nicer than reality. No. She shook her head slowly. It's the truth. You softened him, grounded him, and I think he mistook that stability for something that would always exist, no matter how carelessly he treated it. The room grew quiet again. 20 years ago, hearing those words might have broken me emotionally. Now they simply felt honest. And honesty no longer frightened me. Before leaving, Eleanor paused beside the front door and looked at me carefully. He told me recently that losing you feels like losing the best version of himself. The old version of me might have carried that sentence around for weeks, searching for meaning inside it. This version only felt sadness. Not for myself. For him. Because some people spend so much time chasing admiration that they fail to recognize love while it's quietly holding their life together. After Eleanor left, I walked down toward the shoreline as sunset spread pale orange light across the water. Cold air flushed my cheeks, while waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks below. For years I thought strength meant enduring disappointment without complaint, staying loyal no matter how invisible I became, proving my worth through sacrifice. I was wrong. Real strength was leaving before bitterness turned me into someone I no longer recognized. Real strength was building a peaceful life instead of waiting for someone else to value it. As darkness settled slowly across the harbor, I stood there listening to the ocean and realized something simple but profound. Daniel losing me was never the real story. The real story was that I finally chose myself. And if you've ever felt invisible inside your own life, if you've ever mistaken endurance for love, I hope you remember this piece is not selfish. Walking away from what diminishes you is not failure. Sometimes the quietest decisions become the ones that save you. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. I'd truly love to hear your thoughts and experiences. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, healing, and starting over, subscribe and join us for more journeys like this. There are so many powerful stories still waiting to be shared.